Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon. Amichai of Lab here in home in Harlem, in New York City, on this Sunday morning, mid-Chanukah, and I'm so excited to be in conversation with my dear friend and brother and teacher, Rabbi Danny Lichman in London, along with our teacher, Melissa Raphael, and bring Makor, Hayim, and Lab Shul together, and many other friends. So thank you for joining us to explore the Goddess of Chanukah. And I want to hand it over to Daniel and to the folks across the pond to get us formally and ritually grounded.
Great, thank you, Amichai. Over to Stephanie, who's one of our board members, to just say hello and introduce our community.
Thank you. I'm Stephanie, and I'm a trustee of Makor Hayim. And just to introduce ourselves, we're a new intergenerational community based in Northwest London. We're a community of builders. Our members are all committed to help build and shape this new community. We chose our name to be Makor Hayim, source of life, a source of life not just to the people inside of our community, but also the wider world as we engage with that. And I'd just like to note that we've already taken some inspiration from Lab Shul in the way that we've recently set up a new Kaddish group for our community. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. So I'm gonna say some words of introduction to introduce the whole event. I think it might be good just to start. I'm just going to scroll through the gallery and just look at people's faces and just arrive with all of you. It's really wonderful, and it's such a special thing that this is an international event. We're joining across the different sides of the pond and maybe even beyond. So I'm just going to look at your faces. Welcome, everyone. For me, this is a really, really special event that's happening, and it's a great honor for me to be able to introduce this conversation. So in these opening words, I want to locate what we'll be doing together in time and space. So here we are amidst a pandemic, joining for this cross-Atlantic conversation at a time of political fear and uncertainty. In the UK, we're headed towards a no-deal Brexit still. It's kind of like ongoing thing hanging over us. In the US, we from over here have been following really closely political developments in the US and the fear and the worry that many of you experienced in this period of transition that you're in as well. We've been thinking of you and present with you in all of this. And of course, we're also in this moment of climate crisis, which is continually hanging over us. So the question is, what are the pathways that we can have towards hope at this time? How do we turn towards the divine with the language and imagery, the theology, which would enable us to arrive at a sense of the messianic hope that our tradition is based on? The source of hope is eternal, and today we'll be speaking within time with specific people joining for this conversation. So I'll first introduce Rabbi Amichai. Rabbi Amichai is an artist, a thinker, an activist, Israeli-American, and rabbinic founder and spiritual leader of Lab Shul. In our decade-long Chevruta, which we started in New York many years ago and have continued in Jerusalem and for moments in London and now on WhatsApp video calls, we've explored many themes, yet there's some that we've come back to time and time again. One of these is what does it mean for us to be gay men and Jewish spiritual seekers? How can we come to understand the profound gifts that Amichai and I and many other people bring as queer people to the world? How can we find ways to offer that gift which we bring in our role as Jewish spiritual teachers and rabbis? It was in conversation with Rabbi Amichai that I first began to explore a question that became my rabbinic thesis. What would emerge if we were to think of the Torah like a gay icon, a woman who resists the patriarchy, and in doing so, teaches us how to resist oppression, how to hold and heal trauma, and how to rebuild. And my hope today is that our Torah learning will help us do just that, to continue to free Torah wisdom from the confines of a tradition that has often hidden and obscured her. And in my dialogue with Amichai, amidst the jokes and playfulness, and often in some jokes that many people will be uncomfortable with, there's the lurking terror of the Shoah in the background of this of that which devastated our people and so many people in Amichai's family. And amidst Amichai's searching that him and I have spoken about over the years for some kind of theological meaning in any way with a response to the Shoah, Amichai came across the work of Melissa Raphael. So I'm delighted to introduce Professor Emerita Melissa Raphael as well. Melissa's a theologian, an academic, a scholar, and a teacher who's written widely on Jewish and feminist theology. Her book, The Female Face of God in Auschwitz, is really a remarkable piece of work. It's a painfully moving and even redemptive feminist transformation of the field of post-Holocaust theology. She invites us to put aside male fantasies of omnipotence that are often projected onto God, and instead notice the possibility that human beings, even in the midst of terrible circumstances, might still be able to act as the agents of the divine in the world. I'm humbled to have been taught by Melissa and honored now to be her teacher and rabbi at Makor Hayim. I also want to acknowledge the journey that you've been on, Melissa, from a secular Jewish background through a deep study of Jewish thought, but they're often centered on reading and writing. And now it's wonderful to have you in our community of a live Jewishness, where as a group of people, we get to be face to face, or right now, screen to screen, with other people with whom we can build community and can invite the presence of the divine into one another's lives. And so we come to our conversation, to this meeting in this time and in this space. We come here from the desperate search for meaning out of despair. We come from a recognition that a patriarchal male fantasy of an omnipotent God has left us stuck. We come here from this moment of the emergency of ecocide, of the destruction of so many species in our planet. And we come here towards a new messianic hope for the future, which we begin this Chanukah. In a few moments, Melissa will present on the Jewish goddess and Chanukah, and Amichai will offer some responses to this. And then we'll have a moment of conversation between the three of us. And following this, there'll be the opportunity for those who are joining live to contribute your thoughts and questions. Before we begin and go into the conversation, I think it's important we have a moment where we use song and going in between song and silence in order that we can invite the soul and the spirit into this moment. So as we, by way of arriving into the possibility of this conversation, I want to invite Kehanet Yael to lead us in song for a moment to help us arrive. So over to you, Yael.
Thank you, Rabbi Daniel. So let's just all take a moment to take a deep breath. It's easy to forget how to do that. And let's use this song as a way to arrive, to remind ourselves that we are not in a serious meeting and we are not in a serious class. We are here to do some really deep learning together, some deep encounter, to be in community, and hopefully discover something new about this holiday. The original lyrics to this song are about banishing the dark, but they have been changed by Rav Kohenet Rabbi Jill Hammer and Rabbi David Mavorach Siedenberg to be about sanctifying the dark. If you like, you can use words, and if you'd rather, you can stay on the nigun, the wordless song. Just pick your favorite syllable or go between, and let's see what happens. החושך לקדש, בידינו אור ואש, כל אחד הוא אור קטן, וכולנו אור איתן, קומה חושך על שחור, קומה לקראת האור, קומה חושך על שחור, קומה לקראת האור, בנו חושך לקדש, בידינו אור ואש, כל אחד הוא אור קטן, וכולנו אור איתן, קומה חושך על שחור, קומה לקראת האור, קומה חושך על שחור, קומה לקראת האור, בנו חושך לקדש, בידינו אור ואש, כל אחד הוא אור קטן, וכולנו אור איתן, קומה חושך על שחור, קומה לקראת האור, קומה חושך על שחור, קומה לקראת האור, בנו חושך לקדש, בידינו אור ואש, כל אחד הוא אור קטן, וכולנו אור איתן, קומה חושך על שחור, קומה לקראת האור, קומה חושך על שחור, קומה לקראת האור, יאי 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 ay 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 ay
Thank you, Yael. I now invite Melissa to offer us her presentation.
Thank you. It's an honor and a delight to be with you all today. We begin in 1979 in the foothills of the northern Sinai Peninsula, in a little shelter for travelers that was hewn from the rock about 3,000 years ago. There, the archaeologist Zev Michel has found some Hebrew inscriptions and storage jars, dating from somewhere between the 9th and 8th century before the Common Era. And what makes this find explosive is that written on these was an appeal for blessings from YHWH and his Asherah. On storage jar A, Asherah was symbolized by a drawing of a tree. Similar later inscriptions were found at Kibbet el-Kom near Hebron. Now, while the translation and the interpretation of a few of these words is of course debated, they do suggest that the Israelite god had a consort, Asherah, and that both he and Asherah were invoked by early Jews as a source of protection and blessing. The Hebrew Bible refers to Asherah about 40 times, sometimes in an image of the goddess herself, sometimes as a green tree, sometimes a grove, a pole, but always in hostile terms. Biblical history and archaeology are, of course, fiendishly difficult to piece together because the events that they record and their textual interpretation are shaped by very heavy theological and political agendas. Nonetheless, the biblical text indicates that monotheism didn't spring fully formed from year one of Jewish history. A sculpted Asherah, as most of you probably know, was present in the first temple in Jerusalem for about 250 years. From 1 Kings from the book of 1 Kings, we know that she was worshipped by the royal family of Judah. 400 prophets of Asherah ate at Queen Jezebel's table. The numbers are probably hyperbolical, but I love to imagine the scene, the noise. Jeremiah mentions a queen of heaven, probably Asherah, for whom the women would bake round-shaped devotional cakes. And we know from 2 Kings that they wove doubtlessly exquisite coverings for her image. All this until the moment of numinous horror, when on the order of King Josiah, she was brought out from the house of the Lord to the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem and burned. Even her ashes were beaten to death, to a dust or nothingness that was then scattered with utter contempt over the graves of the common people. The decree had gone out. The territorial dispossession of the indigenous people of Canaan was also to be a spiritual dispossession. There must be no adulteration of the land and the power of its national god. No one was any longer permitted to put up an Asherah pole beside an altar of the Lord, which obviously must have been happening, otherwise nobody would have bothered to forbid it. Now, by the time the Jews returned from exile in Babylon and the Second Temple had been rebuilt, their Asherah was all but forgotten, her grave, as it were, unmarked, unvisited. And yet, her trace remains. Tikva Freimer-Kensky and many other feminist scholars have argued that some of the attributes of the biblical God who gives birth and comforts her children are vestiges of the Hebrew goddess absorbed into God. Now, after this little history lesson, you may be wondering, well, yeah, okay, but what's the connection between the Canaanite Asherah and Hanukkah? Is there a trace of the goddess in Hanukkah? Well, I would say have a look at your menorah. Does it remind you of a stylized tree? Might vestiges of the Hebrew goddess have been absorbed into this great symbol of Jewish resistance? Well, of course, I have to say, nowhere in the classic Jewish texts is there any suggestion that a menorah is an image or symbol of the goddess Asherah. What serious scholars have rather suggested is that there is a shared tradition of sacred or cosmic trees in the ancient Near East. Sacred trees, talking, singing, oracular trees appear everywhere in Torah. From Eden's tree of life to the balsam trees who used the wind in their rustling leaves to save the Israelites from death at the hands of the Philistine armies, and on perhaps to the Hanukkahs we're lighting in our homes and cities tonight in the pandemic year of 2020. Now, although the Torah's arboreal connections with the Hebrew goddess have been repeatedly severed and finally forgotten, for the last 40 years or so, scholars and Jewish feminists have been remembering her, literally bringing life back to her limbs or branches, whether by scholarship or by a powerful interweaving of scholarship and theopoetics. Some, like Carol Myers, have identified the tree of life in Eden as a polemic against Asherah. The text warns, don't be beguiled by her fruits or the slippery creatures who live in her boughs into thinking that you are immortals. If you listen to Asherah, the text might be saying, you will be cast out from the land. Others have studied the transition from Asherah as a goddess of trees to a symbol of the divine in the book of Proverbs. There, wisdom, Lady Wisdom, Chokhmah, is described as a tree of life to those who hold fast to her. And when this is said, as we return the Torah to the Ark, the Torah is being described as a tree of life, a female tree of life. Some have said even that the word me'usha, meaning blessed or happy, has the same Hebrew root as the word Asherah, Aleph, Shin, Resh. So since the menorah of the desert tabernacle was figured as a golden almond tree whose branches are in bud and blossom, the Jewish tree of life has, as we know, weathered many storms. The menorah tree even when its cups seem to have not enough light for another day, is the great symbol of the endurance and resilience of the Hebrew people, and perhaps also of the divine feminine. This menorah was scratched into the walls of the catacombs, the Roman catacombs, by Jewish prisoners awaiting execution. Nearly 2,000 years later, it was scratched into the walls of Theresienstadt and Auschwitz. And when I say that I think that it's a beautiful thing to remember that Asherah is the tree in the middle of the grove whose roots are wound around all our Jewish trees, including our Hanukkah menorahs, I'm not suggesting that we all revert to some pre-Judaic, biophilic, gynocentric idyll of free love under trees, if such ever actually existed. Okay, full disclosure, I do have an Asherah myself, but it's just the it's just a willow tree that I planted in my garden. Willow, because the rabbis associate Asherah with willows among a number of other trees. And I like the idea of a ghost tree that connects me to my foremothers, of a tree that, like all willows, draws deep on water and so connects me to Tehom, the great deep upon the dark face of whose heaving womb waters God's spirit moves. Like all trees, she's a banister to hold on to as we move between the earth and the sky, as we immerse, as it were, in the cosmic mikveh of the sea and emerge onto dry land renewed. But not everything that is holy is worshipped. I don't pour out libations to my garden Asherah. The cakes I bake probably aren't for her. The goddess, for me, isn't in addition to God. She gives the holiness of this earth a female name that was loved by my foremothers and fathers. As such, for me, the Asherah menorah is a prophetic sign raised at a time when the industrial patriarchal assault is laying waste to creation, when wildfires are setting trees alight the world over, when trees are still being hacked down in the rainforests. Asherah recalls us to the lost woodlands of ancient Israel, where under every green tree she welcomed lovers, strangers, animals, seeking her shade, fruit, and fuel. In her, we remember our foremothers and fathers' understanding of the sanctity, the hospitality of trees, of the earth. So to conclude, the Torah gives those who once loved her no voice, nor does it give a voice to those whose land was colonized precisely by destruction of their sacred, of their native sacra. But it seems to me that Asherah, the tree, the figure, is not an idol. Jews do not, and almost certainly did not, worship her instead of God. The real idolaters are those who commit arboricide to fuel a conquest of nature that transfers divine power over life and death to themselves and their economic markets. At Hanukkah, I, for one, celebrate the Hebrew tree goddess as she lights our way through our many winters, through the times that bury hope, when all seems lost or dead. She speaks, she sings, she breathes. As in Avot de Rabbi Natan, it is the tree who prays in the words of the psalmist, "Let not the foot of arrogance come upon me, nor the hand of the wicked shake me." As in Targum Sheni on Megillat Esther, she joins the other trees in beseeching us not to hang even the wicked on her branches, to let the tree of life live. So as the moon rises tonight, behind the branches of the winter tree that might be outside your window, you too might see her face peeping through the branches. You might see the misty light of the Shekhinah veiling her crown. When the spring comes and a pale sun dapples her leaves and blossoms, you might see the wings of the Shekhinah protecting the fledglings in her bough. And if she is old and strong, why not climb her like a child and look out over the hills and fields to a better future? Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Melissa. Wonderful. Let's go straight to Rabbi Amichai.
Wow. Melissa, good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon.
Thank you so much for these, every second word deserves its own lengthy conversation. And I'm so glad that we're having this one with 40 plus of our new friends and old friends. And I'm hopeful that we have many more. I want to say that I'm having like this celebrity crush moment with you. Having found your very profound writings many years ago, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then when I discovered that in a conversation with Daniel that he knows you and we can actually be in touch, it was like, oh, wow. Oh my goddess. So this is a huge treat and a real privilege. And it reminds me of a moment when I was in Rome having dinner with my dear friend Sandy, who's on, and there was this lovely couple sitting across from us who were introduced as Martha and Judith. And through the course of the conversation, it turned out that it's Judith Plaskow who's on today with Martha. And I had one of those like, oh my God, I'm having a total, not just a celeb, but a very, very important teacher encounter. So welcome Martha and Judith, and welcome many, many friends from all over the world, teachers and colleagues. What we're talking about tonight is so profound. Tonight, I'm already imagining our candlelighting in a little bit. And the work that so many have done before us and are doing now is nothing less than prophetic and a paradigm shift. And Melissa, what you've walked us through briefly, the history of Asherah, everything sounds better in British, I have to say. The history of Asherah and the notion that our history as Jews, as Hebrews, as Semites, as humans, was not always our Father who art in heaven, Adonai Tzevaot, the God of the Bible we grew up on, who might not be an idol in the sense of an idol, but is an idol. Because as you said, Melissa, it is the hallmark of patriarchy and the hallmark of the binary hierarchy, oppressive, masculine, hetero, normal reality that so many of us were born into and are still part of. That is what the Jewish Godhead in some ways has come to represent, and has been then lent to Christianity and Islam and other of the Abrahamic monotheistic religions. And this is not an intellectual exercise. I want to say that for me, this is a lifeline. When I, in my teens, as someone who grew up in Israel, religious, Orthodox, realized that I was gay, that meant that God doesn't love me. That meant that the most sublime sacred of safety in the books that I revered, in the rituals that I observed, in the family I lived with, synagogue I prayed in, the community I was with, I was not welcome. I was an abomination. Who I was and had no choice over was a crime. And my beginning of challenging the Judaism I grew up with to find the one that I want to grow with was from a very personal sense of angst. How can this be my God? How can this be my Torah? Where's the love? Where's the acceptance? And that led to my understanding that as a man, I have privileges that women don't. Later, I understood what it's like to be heir to a tradition that prioritizes some over others. But it didn't feel right. My sense of the joy of Shabbat, the mystery of traditions, that it was all too juicy to be thrown away because of just the boys are running the show. So my long journey over the years has led to queering and feminizing, challenging, wrestling, reinterpreting, translating, messing with the Judaism I inherited to create we don't know what to call it, I loved your vision before, Melissa. I think we can actually play with that. But clearly for not just me and you and many of us, few on this call, we're exactly 44, by the way, which is the exact number of candles you get in your average Chanukah box, 36 plus 8. So here we are. We are the menorah right now. All 8 nights. All those juicy symbols led me to understanding that the Judaism I inherited is not without an agenda, that it is subjective, that it's always been subjective, that it was men primarily who kept the writings, even though it was all of us of many genders who kept the traditions and the stories and the symbols and the icons and the recipes and the deliciousness that makes our Jewish life, not just the lighting of the menorah, but the recipe of the latkes. And not just the menorah, which is the Maccabees that redeemed the holiday. The Maccabees, let's be honest, if I was in that time, I'd be stabbed to death by the Maccabees for being a Hellenizer, right? All the stories I grew up on, I'm actually on the other side, right? I grew up on the story that our ancestors were not allowed to practice their religion, and that sucks, and that there was religious and political oppression then and now. Sides change, but that doesn't stop. And that Judah, the Maccabee means the ones who wields the big hammer, and his dad and brothers were this elite commando. Remember, I grew up in Israel in the 70s, who were there to redeem the day and to fight the oppressors and to turn on the lights in the temple and bring religious freedom. Yay, why say no to that? And then I started realizing that there's more to the story. And today I realized that I may have been one of the Hellenizers who defended being one with the people and not in a tribal, narrow reality, but that nevertheless, the menorah that I am lighting is ironically, beautifully, heroically, mysteriously, mischievously, the goddess herself, disguised as a lamp on my windowsill, on your table, the symbol of Judaism, so beautifully, Melissa, you talked about it's being etched for all these generations in moments of great despair and great joy. She snuck her way into front stage. Not unlike, by the way, the Torah scroll. The Torah scroll is always a she. I saw a comment in the chat like, is the goddess an idol? Well, yes and no, because the goddess is an idea. It's the feminine sense of being. And it's not female, it's feminine. It isn't an object. It's about being in subjective relations with each other. The Torah scroll is an object. It's always a she. She's got a crown, she's got a dress. We refer to her in the feminine. And there she is, wisdom, right there in the middle of our monotheistic abstract tradition. So the menorah, and that's a revelation I had this year, is the tree of life. And it's not just Jewish, it's human. It isn't just about survival, it's about thrival. It is the ancient midwinter recipe for how to handle the blues. And our ancients pre-electricity knew that the nights are getting longer, and the ways to battle that is to bring on the light. And somehow that notion of the feminine divine infiltrated our tradition. So this year I'm lighting my menorah, inspired by all these learnings, and these conversations with Melissa and Daniel and others of you over the months. I actually went, and some of you may have seen my little video that I excitedly put up on the eve of Chanukah 3 days ago. I went to the nearby park and I picked up a branch from a tree. I think it's an elm, I can't tell. And I drilled holes. I'm actually drilling a hole every night. And the act of drilling a hole in a piece of wood, honoring the tree, putting the little oil things in it, watching them lit, feels the most connected I have to Chanukah, because it's not about the Chanukah tchotchkes and Judaica, even though I have a beautiful menorah that I cherish. It's connecting to the older gift of nature, pre-culture. In the middle of this pandemic, in this isolation, I'm lighting home alone. Nobody smells my latkes oil but me. The connection to the tree, connection to the sense of chesed, of love that is within here. For me, it's not just an intellectual, theoretical, theological experience. It roots and grounds me in the very reason why I do what I do. it's the response to my anguish as a child and as a teen and as a young man saying, is there room for me in this tradition that doesn't allow women to be in the front of the synagogue or be part of a quorum, that doesn't allow a queer person to be a leader, that is full of a history of victimhood and pain and colonizing and oppression? Can I discover a new branch in the tree of life? So for me, Chanukah this year is a lot about that. In this conversation with Melissa, I know we're going to go deeper into what is the role, what is the benefit of having this version of the divine as opposed to the one we grew up with? What is the gift of Asherah, Shekhinah, and what does it mean to have this combination of the divine masculine, divine feminine as the way to be whole? For a later conversation, when we'll all be late night, I want to talk about, there is something very tantric, actually erotic about the menorah. You take the candle, you put it in the goddess. That's hieros gamos, right there. So there's something very important about this ritual that for me, again, far transcends being Jewish, and at the same time, it is so much of being Jewish. So that I just want to respond a little bit to the notion of Chanukah and why this notion of the divine as non-masculine is so important for me, and the balance is so important. I want to say one thing about the book that was mentioned in some of Melissa's research that has been so important for me. And then, Daniel, I don't know if you want to ask off of that, but let me just mention it. And I want to say I'm holding up this book that has been so precious to me for well over a decade now. The book is called The Female Face of God in Auschwitz, a Jewish feminist theology of the Holocaust, right? So quite a title. And Melissa, I think I told you this about 11 years ago or so, when I was really getting into the theodicy and the theology of suffering. My father, who's now passed, was a Holocaust survivor. I grew up religious under his tutelage. But as he got older and as he got weaker, he wanted to ask some questions. You know, sort of one of his last intellectually able projects was, he called it the 4 questions, the Vier Kashes in Yiddish. He wanted to ask God 4 questions about what happened to him during the war and how could God allow this to happen. And I said, whoa, okay, let me help you with that. And so I went to my bookshelf and many bookshelves to see what has been written about God in the Holocaust. Of course, many, many, many a bookshelf. And among them, a thick anthology called Wrestling with God that includes 99.9 male theologians and philosophers dealing with where was God in the Holocaust, and one voice of a woman, Melissa Raphael, who I had not known, and I read and sobbed. I'll let Melissa talk more about her astonishing and important theological representation of reality. But in short, what this theory says is that perhaps God did die in the Holocaust. The God that died in the Holocaust is the patriarchal vision of a God who is conditional. If you do this, it's going to rain. And if you obey me, I'll be good. The if God, the God of justice and vengeance God, El Kanaot, that Tati and Zaidi, this like old God of so many of our ancestors for generations, that God failed and burned. But another vision of divinity arose from within those furnace and ash days. And that's the vision of the Shekhinah, the divine presence who was there with us in suffering, who was there when people who suffered the most inhumane oppression found love and sacred in the eyes of another who saw them, in the hands of another who held them, in the human representation of divine image that was there to witness their humanity in hell. And so God, an aspect of God died, but an aspect of God became. And if we're thinking about the mid-20th century and feminism and queerism and environmentalism and individualism and how we're saying goodbye to thousands of years of oppressive patriarchy, of which Auschwitz is just one symbol, then something out of that smoke is coming out as a new reality of what's divine and how we are part of that imagery. So, you know, Melissa, I shared some of this, and forgive me for this distillation of your powerful theory. I share that with my father, and with this I'll end. My father is an old Polish Orthodox man, stuck to his guns, and this whole Shekhinah, you know, female stuff, he kind of did his shrug. But I think he heard us, Melissa. I think he felt the wings of the Shekhinah embracing. And I think some kind of solace to his troubled soul, having suffered and witnessed so much suffering, and being part of the building of Israel and seeing the lights go on again. Part of him understood what you were conveying. And I'm very hopeful that we can make your theology light up many, many nights. I believe that what you are suggesting is I was going to say the word reasonable, but the most meaningful and appropriate response to the tragedies and the paradigm shifts that we have and we're living through right now. Dibarti, as they say. Thank you.
Shamati. I think let's take a moment of silence just to allow what we've heard to settle. I'm just going to put both my feet on the ground and breathe for a moment, just to allow a settling, a grounding, a rooting from what we've heard. I think for the next thing, I'd want to give, if Melissa wants to speak again, I'd want to invite you to do that. I've got some things to say as well, but I think I'd be up for Melissa, if you want to respond directly, we can start with you, and I'll speak in a moment.
No, I think I would like to hear from you, Daniel. I mean, I have other things to say, but people have heard from me, and I'm delighted to hand over to you for a minute.
Yeah, great, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of my temptations is, I've been a socialized male in a kind of like patriarchal system in many ways. I've got a temptation to respond to what I've heard by trying to be very clever and use lots of academic language and all of the great things, Melissa, you taught me about how to write and talk theologically. But I realized that if we're going to move this conversation into thinking about, well, what does it mean, tachlis? Like, what does it mean in our lives to be in a worshipful relationship with the divine feminine? I think it might be worth talking about experiences and talking about what's possible. In your writing, Melissa, in your talk just now, you mentioned the tahom, right? The kind of the willow whose roots tap into water, and the tahom, right, which is from the beginning of Bereshit, which is just primeval. And what I want to reflect on is I had an experience this summer where I swam in the nighttime in a lake, and I had this in the darkness, and I had this crazy experience where I felt like the lake was trying to hurt me, like trying to kill me in some way. And I felt the danger of the lake and the despair of the lake and the tahom of it, or the darkness or the emptiness. And of course, there's an invitation for me to learn. And of course, that's the lake within me as well. That's there. I encountered it out in the world, and it's definitely. I can't even explain why. I don't even know why, but I know it's feminine. Like, I know that lake, and there's and with Rabbi Amichai and I have spoken about the imagery of the Hindu goddess Kali, who very helpfully, there's in other traditions, there's this kind of notion of the dark feminine, which is so important and so vital, out of which such creativity can come. So I think I want to just reference that and invite anyone who's here as you're thinking about what we're speaking about, just that what we're talking about is it's not abstract. It's part of our lived experience if we open to it. And I love the image that you ended with, Melissa, with the climbing the tree. So during lockdown, I made friends with trees. I didn't have many people to hang. I mean, I spoke to people loads on the phone. I didn't see many people. So I was there in the West Heath, hugging trees, because they are fine. The trees are so fine. They are like, we need to worry about what other human beings might do to them. But those trees are rooted and they invite me into a relationship with them and into encounter. And so I've been there, being present with those trees, getting to know them and being comforted by them. And so this is the thing, what's out there in nature, the lakes that are out there in nature and also within us, the trees that are available to be grounded and rooted, to help us learn how to be grounded and rooted. This is real. There's an invitation from the universe to us human beings to be in relationship with that, and through that to see what might arise. And I guess there's something else I want to say as well, which is that one of the things as I've been exploring what is the divine feminine, in this sense that we need to go to pay attention to the divine feminine in order to respond to what is happening to our world and the destruction that human beings are doing. And I'm reminded as well that there's in your book, Melissa, you wrote about how in restoring the immanence of God, so in restoring the possibility of the Shekhinah that arises out of encounter, the transcendent God, or the kind of male God, so to speak, will also be restored in a way. And I find, and you said that in your talk now, you spoke about it's not either or, it's not God or goddess. And so there's I have a sense like there's a real invitation for me as a man who whilst with this feminine side that's really important to experience, to explore, there's also, I live in the world as a man, and it's really important for me to explore masculinity. So there's a sense that encounter with the divine feminine and allowance of the Shekhinah, of the immanence of God, of the Shekhinah to arise, can also make possible a return for men in particular, but for men and women, to the masculine kind of archetypes as well, to a kind of male God that's also important once arrived at through the pathway of the divine feminine. Yeah, that's my contribution. I want to open. We've got up like five to 7 minutes, I think, for us to just chat to one another in response to this.
Yeah, there's so much in what you've both said. I don't know where to begin, and also to thank you both also for giving time and space and thought and emotion to my work. But I think that, the goddess isn't for everyone. Some people find it reinscribes, too many kind of feminine attributes that they want to, that they find limiting. I personally don't, because I think in a world of sex dolls and autonomous lethal weapons, a bit of maternity and caring and nature is great. You can associate that with me, that's fine. But what I think is actually in some ways more inclusively interesting to everyone is the way that she unsettles or queers or muddies the waters. She's a provocation, and this is what I feel really powerful, even if you don't like the language of the goddess, because religion is very much a matter of taste. It's the way that she ventilates received Jewish ideas. She kind of oxygenates the Jewish imagination, and I think that's really important as we invite more and more people to the table, more and more genders and ethnicities. It's really important, this kind of ventilation. And she just makes us ask critical questions about who and what defines Jewishness. And that has to be a good thing. I mean, for me, yes, she's a symbol of the liberation of women, earth, and God from patriarchal dominologies, for sure. But she's also kind of interesting insofar as she's both native to Judaism and foreign. She stood in the temple of the Lord, as it were, and at the shrine of Baal. And I think this is good, because I'm not comfortable with heavily patrolled religious borders. I don't like this Athens and Jerusalem binary, establishing walls around us, which are always at the expense of the other. I welcome the otherness. I welcome the fact that a lot of people actually sort of bristle, even at the mention of the goddess. That's good. That shows that something's happening. People are thinking. And also, yeah, I don't like revisionist histories where people just deny what is obvious, which is that the goddess is there in our tradition.
Yeah, Melissa, I want to respond to that and say that I think it's not, for me, it's first of all the evolution of an idea. If our ancestors worshipped gods and goddesses, and there's plenty of archaeology to show that they did, then we are evolving. Our conceptual abstract thinking of divinity and human responsibility evolves. I'm looking at the art that I drew when I was 4 and what I'm working on now. I'm looking at the paintings that my kids created right? Something evolves. And our notion of the divine is evolving with it. One of the most interesting aspects of the monotheistic revolution that burnt the goddess and banished the priestesses and the priest and became body negative and sort of cerebral in some way was also about centralization. The temple in Jerusalem became the only place to worship God. And that was a financial, political, religious decision that had all the power in the elite in Jerusalem, the priesthood that was male dominated, that was a dynasty, that was its very own power structure. And what that power structure did was eliminate the local access to divinity. So those trees that Daniel went to hug during pandemic, and I went to hug my own ones out here, in some way were our local way of saying we're part of nature, not just part of a particular cultural enclave or political entity. We're not the chosen people because we're in Canaan. We are part of this earth. And the sacred is the sacred. And this holy tree over my altar, over my home, in my backyard is where I connect to the most profound of divinity. That's the Asherah, the great tree of life, which we all recognize in some way. And then once the centralization took place, then our spiritual experience became not about us and our bodies and our homes and our complicated sexualities and things. It became about this is how we do it, and this is where it is. Adonai Echad U'Shmo Echad, all in Jerusalem, turn east, amen. Now, I revere the sense that there's directionality, and I honor our ancestry and evolution, but it feels like here we are in Zoom rooms right now. This too is nature. And we are discovering different ways from crisis of tapping into the most sacred that will sustain us and help us survive and thrive. And part of that, because of the feminist revolution, because of the enabling of so many of us to have a voice where otherwise we were voiceless, is challenging the who, the where, the what, the why of spirituality, of religiosity. And I, for one, am so proud that I look back at my Semitic tradition and say, yeah, we had this, right? Thousands and thousands of years ago. And it keeps evolving. It's like a tree. It keeps evolving. And it's a responsibility. And isn't it amazing, Melissa, Daniel, all of us, that what we're talking about now, the notion of the goddess of Chanukah or the feminine divine of Hebrewism is still obscure and even hostile to so many people, because that meme of God the male and masculinity and patriarchy has been so in our system for so long. This feels like subversive frontline conversations with very practical implications to the language we use, the symbols we use, what are we disusing? What do we say no to in order to let Shekhinah and the divine feminine really rise? That's perhaps for a longer conversation.
Yeah, and I'm glad also that Melissa gave space in what you said for that it's also I don't know, as you were speaking, Amichai, I was also thinking, I had a voice in my head which was saying, yeah, but I love Deuteronomy. I mean, I love so much of the stuff in there as well. So so I think the key thing here is like yes, both and. is it's possible to have to have them enriching one another. That kind of instinct of centralization that Amichai spoke about, having done so much danger, it still gave us some gifts as well. And if we can arrive at them the other way around, that can be powerful.
Right. And I want to say, too, looking at the comments in the chat about binarism, that's not the plan. The plan is not to replace the God male with the goddess female. That's
great.
Many sitcoms ago. The idea is both and, a masculine, feminine, God is they, the divine is present in our body, in our mind, and it's not either or. So I'm not saying put Shechina, Asherah, Elohima up there and talk to her just in feminine as to balance the masculine patriarchal language we've had for thousands of years. It's one way of rebalancing the playing field here, but ultimately and deeply it's about both. So embracing our bothness in a deep way.
And actually, I would refer you all to some of Judith Plasko's recent work, which actually points out that in the Hebrew Bible, there's probably, more sort of trans imagery for God than there is just a very binary male or female. There's a lot of morphing going on. There's a lot of fluidity. So I think that's, I'm really glad you mentioned that, Amichai.
Great. I think we're going to draw this section to a close because we've got to our hour mark. So what I'm going to suggest we do is invite Yael to do the Nigun again, and we'll, by way of closing this part of the conversation, and then invite people to stay on for questions and for more of a conversation with everyone who's here. So over to Yael, and then we'll be back in a couple of minutes.
Thank you, everyone. Daniel, Amichai, Melissa. And I feel like this song now has a new kavanah, which is in some way, the dark is often associated with the feminine archetypally. None of these things are essentially masculine or essentially feminine, but sort of on a level of ideas, we often make these connections as humans. And the light is often associated with the masculine. So that kind of interplay between darkness and light, not banishing one or the other, but seeing what happens when you integrate them, is something that we can sing into. Banu choshech lekadesh, beyadenu or vaish, kol echad ur katan, vechulanu or eitan, kuma choshech al hishchor, kuma liknat haor, kuma choshech al hishchor, kuma liknat haor. Banu choshech lekadesh, beyadenu or vaish, kol echad ur katan, vechulanu or eitan, kuma choshech al hishchor, kuma liknat haor, kuma choshech al hishchor, kuma liknat haor. Banu choshech lekadesh, beyadenu or vaish, kol echad ur katan, vechulanu or eitan, kuma choshech al hishchor, kuma liknat haor, kuma choshech al hishchor, kuma liknat haor. Banu choshech lekadesh, beyadenu or vaish, kol echad ur katan, vechulanu or eitan, kuma choshech al hishchor, kuma liknat haor, kuma choshech al hishchor, kuma liknat haor. Yai na nai 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 nai, yai na nai 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 nai, yai 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 yai, ai yai 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 yai, yai 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 yai, yai 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 yai,